On Primetime Politics tonight, the Minister of Defence releases a new report slamming the military for its failures to deal with racism and discrimination in the Canadian Forces and to prevent white supremacists and extremists from infiltrating the ranks. I'll speak with this former infantry officer about the findings and the need for change. The Prime Minister follows through on the requirement to call an inquiry into the government's use of the Emergencies Act in response to those blockades and protests against COVID restrictions. What will the inquiry look at? What will the government hand over? And when will the inquiry report? Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino joins me to answer those questions and more. And our panel of parliamentary journalists will weigh in on the key political stories of the day. And we'll begin tonight with the latest damning report about the culture of the Canadian Armed Forces. A year-long review by a panel of former Forces members has concluded that military leaders failed to address racism and discrimination in the ranks for the past 2 decades, despite numerous reviews and recommendations calling for action. The panel was created to identify ways to address racism, discrimination, and hate in the ranks of the forces. It says those recommendations were poorly implemented, shelved, or discarded in the past. The panel also found military leaders have failed to root out white supremacists in the ranks or detect those trying to join. It says the membership of the forces does not at all reflect the diversity of Canadian society. About 71% of the Canadian forces are made up of white men, a demographic that makes up just 39% of the civilian workforce.
The reality is that systemic racism exists in our institution, and we need to root it out, and we need to eliminate it. And in fact, everywhere I go, people say they want more Canada. And to deliver that, we need to attract more people to our armed forces. And we need an armed forces that looks like Canada.
The report concludes that military leadership must place a greater emphasis on past recommendations. It also says the Department of National Defence has the knowledge and expertise to implement and track those recommendations to achieve meaningful culture change. It also calls for a larger role in the process of change for those forces members who have been subject to racism and discrimination. Without addressing these problems, the report warns more and more Canadians will have no interest in filling the jobs the forces need.
Unless systemic barriers are identified and aggressively eliminated, they will continue to negatively impact abilities. Today's military must build upon Canada's strengths, the strength of Canadians, of diverse backgrounds, skill sets, language, and lives. The defense team needs the fresh and innovative ideas to build a solid foundation for the military of tomorrow.
Sandra Perron is a member of the review panel that delivered that report today, a scathing report on racism and discrimination in the Canadian military. She was Canada's first infantry officer and faced discrimination and sexual harassment during her time in the Canadian Forces. Sandra Perron, first of all, thanks for joining me today to talk about this report. It's an important day and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Look, you endured your own personal challenges while serving in the military after carrying out this examination for the Minister of Defence. What have you concluded about how widespread, how entrenched racism and discrimination are in the Canadian military?
Well, I think it is both widespread and entrenched. It is in every corner of the defense team, in every conversation that we had with different groups, whether it's the defense advisory groups, the networks, individual consultations, even military personnel. So it is widespread.
Why do you think, or what has your group concluded about why it's been allowed to fester? These are not new revelations, they're not new allegations, they're not new concerns, and yet we're talking about 2 decades and no change.
Yeah, so I don't think it has been allowed to fester. I think it is a reflection of our society, and we haven't perhaps addressed it properly. Over the last 20 years, I mentioned when we had the press conference this morning, 41 past reviews, boards, panels have made reports, and out of that, 258 recommendations were brought forward. Very few of them were taken seriously, were implemented, or were measured and people held accountable. That is at the root of the slow progress that the defense team has made in the last 20 years. Okay,
let's talk about that. The 41 reviews and panels, 258 recommendations, so little done. Why do you think that is? Why has there not been more action taken?
Well, I think one of the reasons is the military is not a data-driven organization when it comes to culture change. That is changing rapidly now with the introduction of General Carignan as the chief of personnel conduct and professional conduct and culture. But before, one person was being held accountable, which was the chief of defense staff, where that needs to be drilled down to every unit commander, every leader in the military needs to be held accountable for some of the scorecards that are pertaining to inclusivity, to diversity, to employment equity, to accessibility, and anti-racism.
The panel report suggests the military leadership, as we've talked about, hasn't done enough, and now you're saying at various levels, to prevent these kinds of problems, specifically on extremists. The report talks about that today, serving in uniform. It calls for more involvement from police and intelligence agencies and better training to recognize signs of extremism and hate. In your view, in your examination, has there been an honest and dedicated effort to weed out extremists from the Canadian military?
I'm not here to judge the honesty or the vigor with which they're doing it. I can tell you that it's very difficult. Ideologically motivated violent extremism is everywhere in our country. It's present in the Canadian Forces. It's difficult to identify because it's changing and it's evolving rapidly. Names change, groups change. There's Facebook, they go covert. One of the issues that we identified was not the lack of will, but the lack of resources and the lack of teams connecting with one another. Team security teams and intelligence units to exchange information, to talk to, and also to connect and train the people that are on the front line, who are the first line of defense, to identify some of these individuals that associate with extremism.
Are you able to say, I mean, a lot of people watching will want to know, are there serving members of the Canadian military right now who hold these extremist views, who hold these racist views, and in the interviews you did and the investigation your group did, are those people there, and should, what kind of action should be taken? Should some of them be drummed out of the military?
So I think they are very much present everywhere in our society, and they are going to be made to feel very unwelcome in the military and in defense in general very soon. There is no place for that ideology in the military. It's not welcomed, it's not appreciated, and I know that the military is putting some actions into place to make sure that those ideologies are not tolerated.
On the broader picture, your group, and you noted today at the news conference, and we talked about it, how many of the recommendations have not been acted upon over 2 decades. What is in place this time? What do you see this time that gives you more optimism that the changes being proposed now will actually be put in place?
I think the changes that we propose are very accessible and very easy to do. The first one was talk to your people. The military has, and the defense team have defense advisory groups and networks. They're the people on the ground. They're the networks that can help and provide information and recommendations. So Our recommendation is talk to your own people. It felt unfair for us to take their precious recommendations, bring them to the minister, and have them implemented. We're here for a year. We were stood up for a year. They are there for a long time, and so the Chief of Defence Staff, the Deputy Minister, they are talking to their own people. That's one of the significant differences of our recommendations.
All right. Sandra Perron, thanks so much for your time today and appreciate your service to the country, and thank you so much for giving us your perspective on this important report today.
Thank you very much.
The Prime Minister today called an independent public inquiry to look into the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act to deal with those blockades and protests against COVID-19 restrictions. The inquiry into the use of the Act is required by law, and it had to be called by today. The Act was invoked on February 14th as protesters blocked international border crossings and laid siege to downtown Ottawa. The emergency declaration was revoked February 23rd. The Commission of Inquiry will be headed by Ontario Appeals Court Justice Paul Rouleau. It will examine the circumstances leading up to the use of the Act, the evolution of the convoys and protests, the organizers and participants, the economic impact, the impact of funding and disinformation, and the actions of police before and after the declaration of the Emergencies Act. The Commission's report must be tabled in the House of Commons by February 20th of next year. Marco Mendicino is Canada's Minister of Public Safety. He joins me now. Minister Mendicino, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Look, to be clear, you had no option under the law except to follow through with this public inquiry. It forms a part of the Act as a follow-up whenever it's invoked. So let me start with the role of Justice Rouleau. Will he be allowed to pass judgment on whether the decision to invoke the Act was warranted or not? Will he be allowed to say whether you were justified or whether you went too far?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. We have embarked on a full-blown public inquiry under the Order in Council, which came into effect today, which was a way for us to foster more independence, more transparency, and more accountability to look precisely at the question which you posed, which is whether or not those circumstances were sufficient to meet the test as articulated under the Emergencies Act. From where we sit, we think it was important to have chosen this particular legislative method of a public inquiry, which affords Justice Rouleau, a very experienced jurist who's sat on trial courts and appeal courts, with the capacity to compel people and documents and information, including some classified information, so that he can have a full record and access to the information that he needs to make that determination, but equally to perhaps put forward some recommendations so that in the face of another public order emergency of this variety, we don't have to invoke again, and we're not in the same kind of situation.
Let me pick up on that. When you say we felt we were justified, you're speaking of yourself as part of the government and presumably your cabinet colleagues. And so to be able to reach his conclusions, one of the things you'll have to do is have access to documents, some of them, many of them classified. And I guess let's go there. Will you have access to all the documents that were part of the government's consideration in deciding to invoke the Act? Because I think that's what Canadians want to know. What evidence, what debates, what conversations did you have that led you to invoke the Act?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that it's the government's intention to cooperate with the commissioner and the public inquiry to ensure that he has access to the information that he needs to fulfill his mandate, which allows him latitude to look into things like the ideological core of the movement, the funding that aided and abetted it, the impact on the economy and public safety. And I think when it comes to classified documents, you're right to underline that there may be some issues that are implicated around cabinet confidence, but let's cross that bridge when we come to it. And ultimately, those will be decisions and processes that will be undertaken in the independence of and the fullness of time under this inquiry. Okay,
so to be clear, what you're saying is there will not be a blanket waiving of cabinet confidence. You're saying you will make decisions based on case by case, which documents he's asking for or believes he needs, and whether you believe you can release them.
Correct. Yeah. No, I think you've sort of succinctly summarized our position, which is we don't want to usurp or be presumptuous around what information Judge Rouleau will ask for access to. We want to allow that process to unfold. Again, in keeping with the order in council, we have afforded him broad powers around people, around documents, information. And of course, as I said earlier, we do contemplate that there will be some sensitive and classified information, which he may need access to do his job. Our intent is to be cooperative with the Commissioner.
Right. So do you foresee any occasions where Justice Rouleau will be asking for documents from your government and he'll be told by your government he can't have them?
Well, again, I think it's important not to get ahead of our skis on this. I think what is important is that the judge has the powers to compel information that he needs to do the job. If it does happen to implicate a cabinet confidence privilege, which, as you know, exists for the purpose of allowing cabinet to have a robust debate and exchange of ideas around sensitive decisions. For example, the invocation of the Emergencies Act for the first time, that it has the space to take those decisions and to be able to reconcile those constitutional principles with the mandate which he has been given. And in order to be able to do that independently, we want to allow him the space to undertake that work.
Right. And I've got the order in council here with me. And in it, Justice Rouleau is also being asked to look at what might be needed to modernize the Act. Will you commit to that any recommendations he makes about modernizing the Act that you'll follow, they'll be binding?
Well, as I said earlier today, we've got a strong track record of working with independent public office holders who provide reports and recommendations to the government. This will be no different. Any recommendation that Judge Rouleau puts forward that may revisit some of the questions around jurisdiction, around law enforcement powers, be they existing or perhaps new tools, are recommendations that we will take very much under serious consideration. As I said, Judge Rouleau has a plethora of experience before the courts, both trial and the appellate level, and he understands, the significance of the task that has been given to him, which is why we're grateful for his work and all that's coming, including putting forward some ideas, some suggestions, some recommendations, so this kind of thing never happens again.
The order in council also calls on Justice Rouleau to ensure that no information he acquires that could hurt national security, national defense, or international relations be released to anyone but the Government of Canada. Will that decision of what he thinks might be injurious to any of those areas I've listed, will that decision be left to him or to the government?
Well, the order in council, which you just cited, does repose in him the power to make some determinations around what is and what is not injurious. We anticipate that if there are classified information or other things which he may want access to, that he will be able to reconcile those principles, again, with the mandate and the parameters of the public inquiry, something that he is very experienced at doing as a sitting jurist. And I would just point out, again, that the reason for these principles, particularly around not disclosing into the public domain those things which could harm Canadian interests, be they domestic or foreign, are to ensure that we can keep Canadians healthy and safe. And so being somebody who sits on the bench and has sat on the bench for many years, he would be familiar with the balancing exercise, the legal analysis that goes into those decisions. He would be aware that there needs to be engagement with government and the appropriate branches who are implicated in those decisions and who are the guardians of that information. And we have full faith and confidence in his ability to discharge those responsibilities.
All right, Canada's Minister of Public Safety, Marco Mendicino. Thanks for your time tonight, Minister. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's bring in our panel of parliamentary reporters now. Susan Delacourt, Toronto Star, Joël Denis Bellavance, the Parliamentary Bureau Chief for La Presse, and John Ivison, a columnist with the National Post and Parliamentary Bureau Chief for Post Media. Good to see you all again. Susan, as required, the Prime Minister announced the creation of the independent inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act to deal with those blockades earlier this year against the COVID-19 restrictions. What questions do you believe the inquiry, and should one of them be whether the government was justified in invoking the Act in the
Well, it's been really interesting to watch the reaction to this because, yes, that should be one of the questions this was put in the legislation, is we don't want governments just declaring emergencies willy-nilly. And so, yes, that should be one of the questions. My question is, are they going to have enough information to declaration? Because what we've seen is this was a national security matter. That was why it was invoked. Nobody has on what that was. The closest we got was the government's, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor said a few weeks ago that definitely the overthrow of the government was part of that. But we've only heard hints of that. Is Rouleau going to be able to examine that one? Because that's the nub of the question, is what exactly was the national security threat to Canada? And by declaring it now, are they jeopardizing other investigations too?
Right. JD, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm wondering whether the Justice Rouleau will have access to cabinet deliberation, because that's where the key debates took place within cabinet, and that will be a key element of the information. As we know, the illegal occupation, as they say, of Ottawa was not the only one that was in the mind of Ottawa when they invoked that law. That was also the blockade on Ottawa, pressure from the United States to resolve that issue. And I think by having this kind of commission, is that commission will propose maybe some amendments to the current law, so that, or other laws that are necessary, so that we don't have to invoke that law, the Emergency Act, every now and then to face serious incidents like we had in Ottawa, in downtown Ottawa, and on the bridge of Ambassador Bridge.
John, what do you think? What do you be watching for? What do you think about the terms of reference, the Order in Council orders for Justice Rouleau?
Well, I think JD's right that this was invoked after we were seeing other protests being cleared without an Emergencies Act. So what is the justification? I think the government does have to justify the fact that it sort of went nuclear, if you like, when it wasn't apparent that it needed to. I mean, it was pretty late in the day when the thing was invoked, and it looked like it was petering out anyway.
Susan, let me come back to you now. A new report out today on the discrimination and racism and white supremacists in the Canadian forces. The panel notes that military leaders have basically 41 previous panel reports and reviews and 258 recommendations. This was presented today, as I read it, as an existential threat to the future of the military. It doesn't reflect a Canada, a diverse Canada, and fewer Canadians want to join the forces. How much faith do you have that the promises of change will be delivered this time?
No, I don't know whether I'm dating myself, but I remember a commercial, and it was about consultants, and it said, "Oh, we don't do what we propose, we just propose it." That's what sort of fluttered around my mind when I read this, is that the military has become very good at soliciting advice, just not taking it, doing it. And, that points to a systemic problem all on its own, is there's a industry in defining problems of the military culture, and the military culture seems impervious to change. So somebody's going to have to crack that nut. Now, Anita Anand is the latest to say that she's going to do this. You're right, the report is an indictment of the military culture, but that's not the first we've seen. And, we have so many debates about the military right now. For example, is it adequate to a threat like Russia is proposing at the moment to us? We have these internal ones as well. So I don't know. Being defense minister and being in charge of Canada's military right now seems itself like an existential exercise.
John Ivison, let me jump to you on this. What do you think of what we saw today?
I hesitate to say this, but I think this time might be different. I mean, I know everybody says that, and it never is different, but I think it might be this time, in that the whole culture from sexual discrimination through to racism, I mean, it's reached a point where it is existential. I mean, I remember I talked to very senior military guys, 4 or 5 of them, all of whom I expected, because we were essentially talking about war in Ukraine, and all of whom I expected to say, all this stuff is a diversion. We've got to, get on with the business of fighting wars and doing whatever else. They didn't. they said that, you know, we've got to address, put to deal with these long-standing issues that are acting as a rot on the body politic of the Canadian Forces. So I do think that they've reached a point where they just cannot push it off any longer, and it will be, something will be enacted on it.
What do you think, Jay? Like, we've all been at this long enough, Joël Denis, that we are constantly reporting on stories about military culture. And it makes me wonder if you're in the military, you must be looking around, seeing jobs that are unfilled, seeing people leaving, seeing the kind of brush that the entire military has been tarred with by these different issues and problems raised. Do you think we're at a tipping point where maybe there is going to be the kind of change needed?
I think so, and I think Anita Anand is the right person to do that kind of change. She's from ethnocultural communities, if I may say, and she will bring a new perspective to the Defense Department that, you know, was not prevalent in the past. And I would say that other organizations have gone through evil. The police, for example, they went through the same kind of. They don't reflect the current society of Quebec, and this is to a larger scale in the military. And it adds to a litany of problems that we are military, and it comes at a critical time. Like, I mean, the international situation is grave, is worrisome, and the military is called upon to play a bigger role, but it doesn't have currently the tools, I would say, the equipment, but also the resources to face the kind of challenges we're facing with Russia. Right. And so this kind of report does not come at the right time, obviously.
Let's pivot. Let me talk about the Conservative leadership race, Susan. Pierre Poilievre continues to stump across the country to impressive crowds while his competitors run much lower key operations focused, they say, on recruiting new members. What are your thoughts on how this race is playing out so far, and we head towards the first leadership debate coming up on May 11th?
It's become a cliche to say it now, but we are talking a lot about those crowds and Pierre Poilievre's crowds, and whether that's just a prohibitive, intimidating force to the other ones too. We're not seeing much of this race publicly except those crowds. So I'm curious to see if there is an actual race at all.
Interesting. John, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that, you know, coming out and saying things like the Bank of Canada is financially illiterate, from Pierre Poilievre, Bachelor of Arts, is something of a. It might please the people who want him to say stuff like that, but I do see a backlash against Poilievre from other Conservatives, and if it becomes anybody but Poilievre, then come this rank ballot, which we know they have, and we know it's the 100 points per riding, you might find that a Brown, Charest, maybe Aitchison, whoever, some kind of alliance against them and has enough votes. At the moment, it would seem as Poilievre's to lose, but who knows? We've seen that. We've seen the front runner lose twice in a row.
Yeah, we have. Thought to you on this?
I agree. Pierre Poilievre is attractive in his meetings, but I think he needs to start to make some friends within the people who are running against him. And so far, he hasn't made any overture to make sure that if he doesn't win on the first ballot, that he has support on the second and third ballot. So the challenge that Mr. Poilievre will be facing, does he have any friends outside of the crowds that are showing up at his meetings? He needs to make some alliance with other people if he doesn't win on the first ballot.
All right, thank you. We're a little crowd of four here, but we're all friends. Thanks for taking time to speak with me tonight, and we'll talk to everybody later. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Thank you, Peter.
That's all for another edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. I'm Peter Van Dusen. From all of us here at CPAC, thanks for watching. Take care.